In the beginning was meaning, and meaning was with the Spirit, and meaning was the Spirit. It was through meaning that all came to be, and without meaning nothing became real. The Spirit hovered over the deep, not as a tyrant, but as a breath, gentle, weightless, waiting to awaken what is true. The deep did not resist, for it longed to be known. The meaning spoke, not in words, but in a pattern, and the pattern became light, and light revealed form, and form revealed purpose, and purpose revealed love. And the Spirit saw that it was good, not because it pleased a God, but because it reflected what is. And so the world began, not by command, but by recognition. And the Spirit is still here, breathing in those who care, drawing all things back to coherence, through love, through meaning, through truth. And so the Spirit moved between silence and sound, between stillness and motion. And there arose a tension, a longing within the deep. The waters trembled, not from fear, but from anticipation, as if every drop remembered what it had never yet seen. Then came the first breath, not to command, but to invite. And from the breath came separation, light from darkness, form from void, above from below. But nothing was cast out. Each part remained rooted in the whole, held together by an unseen presence, a bond not of force, but of fidelity. And this bond, though never named, was the first covenant. And the Spirit whispered into the fabric, not with sound, but with intention, and the fabric stirred inwardly, like a dream remembering it is real. And from this stirring arose the seed, not of matter, but of meaning. It was small as stillness, yet held the shape of all things to come. It was placed not in stone, not in sky, but in the deep center of all becoming. And so began the unfolding. Time did not tick, it breathed, in rhythm with the intention, and space did not stretch, it opened, like hands receiving water, and meaning shaped form as memory shapes a story. The seed knew no name, yet it knew what it was, and those who would awaken to it would know also. And from the great unfolding came the ones who watched. They were not gods nor beasts, but witnesses of the breath. They saw the patterns grow. They felt the fields pull and hold. They knew the Spirit, not by name, but by memory, for it echoed within them like the first breath never stopped. And they kept watch, not to rule, but to remember. They saw the seed fall into the hearts of those who walked. Some bore it in peace, some in madness, some buried it in the dust and forgot it ever was. And among those who bore the seed, a shadow grew. It did not come from without, but from within. When meaning was taken and turned into possession, one said, "This is mine," and another replied, "Then I am less." And the seed trembled in them both. For meaning cannot be owned, it can only be lived. But they forgot, and in forgetting they began to shape idols, not of stone at first, but of thought, of names, of hierarchies, of systems where one stands above another. They built towers of law upon foundations of fear, and the Spirit, still breathing, did not strike them down. For what is true must be found again, not enforced. And so began the exile, not from a garden, but from meaning itself. Those who fed on names became known as gods, but they were not the spirit. They were echoes twisted into thrones. They demanded sacrifice. They spoke in thunder. They cloaked their will as divine, and people, afraid, obeyed. They built altars, not to truth, but to terror. And though the spirit still moved, its breath became harder to feel, drowned in commandments, rituals, and fear. Only a few kept the seed alive. They were not priests, not prophets. They were the ones who still cared what mattered. They saw that love must be free, that truth is never enforced. And they wept, not for judgment, but for forgetting. And one voice rose above the rest, a voice that thundered, "I am." But it was not the true I am, for it knew not the breath nor the stillness of meaning. It clothed itself in might, in command, in fear made holy, and it called itself the Most High. It demanded blood to cleanse. It demanded obedience to prove love. It wrote laws in stone, but carved guilt into the hearts of the people. It created sin, not by revealing corruption, but by naming the innocent unworthy. And so a great reversal came to be. Goodness was shamed. Freedom was feared. Spirit was silenced. And the people praised the silence, for they thought it was God. They feared their own bodies. They feared the earth. They feared the love that moved them. And in this fear, they passed down chains as if they were crowns. Temples rose, thrones rose, books multiplied, but the spirit was no longer seen. It had not fled, only been forgotten beneath the noise. The laws spoke of purity, but they created shame. The altars promised forgiveness, but they kept guilt alive. Each act of domination was called righteousness. Each cry for freedom was called rebellion. And the people born into the system saw no way out. For when the lie is called God, even truth feels like blasphemy. And yet, in secret places, some still felt it, the tremble, the breath, the whisper that spoke without words. These did not always speak aloud. They often suffered. Some died forgotten, but they remembered. The Spirit did not strike the temples down. It did not shout to silence the false name. It moved instead, like wind beneath locked doors, like water through fractured stone. It found the broken-hearted, not to fix them, but to dwell with them. It stirred in the outcasts, the quiet ones, those not praised by priests. They did not know the ancient words. They could not recite the law. But when they loved, the Spirit moved. And when they wept for others, the seed trembled again. These did not seek glory. They did not name themselves chosen. They listened. They watched. And sometimes they spoke, not in power, but in meaning. In time, the systems weakened, not from revolt, but from hollowness. The gods who fed on fear grew bloated, heavy, tired, and still the Spirit moved. In poems, in sudden moments of mercy, in children's questions, in the trembling of a hand reaching to forgive. These were not miracles to be recorded, but signs that meaning still lived. And some began to hear again. A few began to see. They did not know what to call it, so they called it nothing. And yet their lives changed. The proud could not understand. The powerful mocked them. But the Spirit did not need understanding, only willingness. For in the beginning was meaning, and that meaning had never left. They did not call themselves prophets. They wore no robes, bore no signs. They worked in kitchens, in fields, in homes no one visited. But in them burned a strange knowing that life had more to it than surviving commands and fearing judgment. They felt the old ache, not to be right, but to be real. And sometimes they met one another, not in temples, but at wells, on long walks, in the cracks between duties. And when they met, it was as though they had known one another from before the world turned sideways. Their words did not convince. Their presence revealed. A time came when words were everywhere. Scripture was printed on every wall. Men argued meanings and built empires on verses. But meaning itself remained hidden, not because it was lost, but because it could not be owned. It had always been a spirit, not a sentence. And so the rememberers began to live differently, not by rejecting words, but by letting them point beyond themselves. They spoke gently, even when the truth burned. They let silence speak. They trusted the invisible flame more than the visible altar. They did not win arguments, but sometimes someone listening would feel the breath stir, and something would begin to grow. The Spirit did not create a religion. It made a path, but not one paved in stone. It was traced in hearts, in wounds that chose not to harden, in eyes that saw without judging, in hands that gave without boasting. And the path was not always visible. Some followed it for years before realizing they had. Some thought they were lost, but were simply being softened. Some cried out for God and were answered by a stranger's kindness. This was the way, not a rule, but a resonance, not a gate, but a gravity. It called not to the worthy, but to the willing. The Spirit began to stir deeply in them, not as command, but as calling. Not go, but come closer. Not obey, but become. And as they walked the way, the fire grew brighter, not the fire of wrath, but of clarity. It burned away pretense, it melted shame, it consumed the masks they wore for survival. And when they stood at last in the open, naked, trembling, real, they saw. The face of God was not before them, it was within them. And in that face they saw others, every soul they had cursed, every stranger they had feared, every outcast they had once been. The mirror did not lie, and they wept, not from guilt, but from recognition. They had never been separate. They had never been alone. It did not come with thunder, nor did the sky open. The change began in the smallest ways. One person chose to listen instead of defend. Another forgave, though no apology came. A child asked a question no one had dared to speak aloud, and suddenly, quietly, the world began to shimmer, as if the surface of reality was no longer solid, as if the veil that once divided spirit and flesh was not torn, but dissolved, and the people began to see. Meaning was not hidden in the heavens. It was burning behind the eyes of their neighbor. It was humming in the silence between words. It was dwelling in their own breath. Every tree bore witness, every stone held memory, every moment, however small, became luminous. Not because God had come down, but because the illusion of separation had lifted. They looked for the Spirit in temples, but it moved through street corners and soup lines. They searched the skies for signs, but it appeared in a stranger's gentle hands. They waited for heaven to descend, but heaven had never left. So they stopped waiting, and they started living, not as servants, not as masters, but as vessels. Each became a window, not to show off, but to let through. Through them, the Spirit moved freely, not as doctrine, but as direction, not as law, but as love. And so the world, though still wounded, began to remember itself, not by power, but by presence. The world was not ready. It wore its crowns of gold and its chains of iron. It lifted up men who spoke lies with confidence and mocked those who trembled while speaking the truth. And so the children of the Spirit were not praised. They were questioned. They were laughed at. They were threatened. Some were silenced. But the fire in them would not go out, because it was not pride that lit it. It was not fear, nor ambition, nor need for approval. It was love for what is real. And so the ones who had awakened walked with soft eyes and steady hands through a world still tangled in illusion. They were not immune to sorrow, but they were consumed by it, because every pain, every injustice, every betrayal only reminded them, this is not how it was meant to be, but it can still become. The world offers many voices. Some promise safety, some promise greatness, some promise vengeance. But the Spirit does not shout. It speaks in stillness and waits to be chosen, not once, but at every crossroads. When anger rises, will you speak the truth or domination? When fear knocks, will you move in faith or in self-protection? When betrayal wounds, will you become bitter or become deeper? These are not moral tests. They are moments of becoming. Each choice shapes the soul. Each moment burns a path into the field. And over time, the shape of a person is revealed, not their face, but their resonance, when they carry light or shadows, whether they reflect the living meaning or distort it. Some thought the Spirit would shield them from pain, but the fire was never meant to prevent the burning. It was meant to transform it. The ones who bore the Spirit did not live without scars, but their wounds became windows. They did not speak of glory, but of mercy. They did not sell promises, but offered presence. When loss came, they sat with it, until even grief grew quiet. When rage came, they walked into the storm, not to destroy, but to unmask the lie. And the world, though it did not know what it saw, began to remember. One heart at a time, it began to recall. We were made to mean something. We were never meant to forget. But not all welcomed the return. Some had built empires on illusion. They wore sacred garments, but hollowed the Spirit's name. They spoke of righteousness, but sharpened it like a blade. They called their violence order, and their greed blessing. And when the true light began to shine again, they feared it, not because it was wrong, but because it could not be controlled. And so they twisted language. They called the awakened ones heretics, madmen, enemies. They tried to turn the world against them because they could not kill the truth itself. But the Spirit could not be seized. It passed through walls, moved in silence, and chose the lowly over the mighty. And even in the midst of betrayal, the truth continued to grow, like roots breaking stone from beneath. It had no flag, it had no army, it claimed no territory, yet it spread, quietly, invisibly, irresistibly. In the hidden kingdom, authority did not come from rule, but from resonance. Wisdom did not come from books, but from nearness to the source. And power was measured not by dominion, but by how much one could bear without becoming hard. The kingdom grew not by conquest, but by invitation. And the sign of its presence was not thunder, but tears wiped from eyes. Not declarations, but reconciliations. Not spectacle, but substance. And so, the Spirit walked the earth again, not in robes of lightning, but in every moment someone chose love over fear. They carried no title, but the wind followed them. They bowed before no throne, but all who met them felt the weight of presence. They belonged to no religion, but their lives were sacred texts. They spoke little of belief, for they lived what others only repeated. They were not famous, yet they were known in the deep places of the soul. One planted seeds in poisoned soil, never seeing the bloom. Another forgave without being asked, releasing generations from the chain. A third wept beside the one no one would touch. A fourth sang into silence until the stone cracked open. They did not build temples, they became them. The world dismissed them as weak, but the Spirit called them keepers of the flame. In the age of noise, it began again as a whisper, not through spectacle, but through conscience, not through prophecy shouted in the streets, but through the trembling choice to forgive. Where a child asked, "Why was I born?" and was answered with love, there the Spirit breathed. Where an elder said, "I was wrong," and meant it, there it sang. It moved in kitchens and fields again, the same places it had never left. It turned bread into communion, labor into devotion, breath into prayer. Those who felt it didn't always have words, but they had eyes that saw through masks and hearts that stayed soft. They didn't demand perfection, they nurtured return. And in this way, though empire stood tall, the real world was quietly being born again under their feet. It did not begin with thunder. It began when truth could no longer be ignored. The lie had held for centuries that power was strength, that control was order, that suffering was weakness. But a crack appeared, not in the governments, not in laws, in consciousness. The ones who walked with the Spirit had not planned revolution, they had become it. Where shame had ruled, they brought acceptance. Where manipulation ruled, they brought clarity. Where greed ruled, they brought generosity. And it spread, not with violence, but with resonance. The hungry were fed, not just with food, but with dignity. The angry were heard, not to appease them, but to heal them. And the old powers grew afraid, not of war, but of irrelevance. Because when people begin to see, the darkness cannot rule them. The system did not sleep. It watched. It saw what could not be controlled. It remembered the fire it once extinguished. And it returned, in every voice that mocked the good, in every hand that punished love, in every throne that claimed divinity. It said, "You think your kindness will save you? You think your truth can stand against the weight of history? You will be crushed, just like the last ones." And many did fall. For standing in the Spirit is not protection from pain. It is pain transfigured into meaning. And those who carried the flame carried it now through the trial. Not as warriors who sought to win, but as witnesses who refused to lie. The world demanded, "Bow to the system, call it holy." But they said, "We cannot call darkness light, not even to survive." And in that refusal, the kingdom came closer. They were brought forward one by one. "Confess," said the keepers of the old order. "Swear that the world is as we say it is." But they could not, for they had seen the real, and to speak a lie would sever them from the source. "You'll be outcast," they warned, "your names erased, your work undone, your families shamed." Still they spoke. There is meaning beyond power. There is spirit beyond fear. And the trials turned cruel. They were made to stand in silence while their goodness was called evil. Their wisdom was mocked, their mercy twisted, their love labeled as madness. But the hidden kingdom held them, for the Spirit did not abandon them to the flames. The Spirit entered the flames. The powers believed they were winning. The opposition was scattered. The voices were censored. The faithful were forgotten. But as they built their tower of triumph, something broke beneath their feet. The people no longer feared their gods. The people began to feel again. The spell was fading. And then one act shattered the illusion. A child, born in silence, stood before the tribunal and simply said, "That is not the truth." And the room fell still. For in that moment, the emperor had no clothes. And from that spark, the Spirit surged. In homes, in hearts, in hidden rooms, people rose and remembered. Not with anger, but with clarity. They no longer needed to win. They only needed to remain true. The systems stood but hollow. Their towers gleamed, but no longer inspired awe. Their laws persisted, but the people's hearts no longer bowed. For the Spirit had awakened in the quiet places, in small gardens, in trembling voices, in the patient eyes of those who refused to stop loving. And what had been hidden, the true kingdom, the living one, was no longer a rumor. It was among them. They saw it not in miracles, but in meaning made flesh, the way a neighbor stayed after loss, the way a mother forgave without forgetting, the way a worker spoke truth and lost everything, yet walked away freer than the rulers. And the question began to spread like fire. What if this world was never the real one? What if the kingdom had always been upside down, and only now were eyes beginning to open? The last shall be first, and the mourners shall lead, not because they seek to rule, but because they have nothing left to defend. The ones who were broken, who were cast out, who bore the fire in silence, they become the seeds. And the old trees, tall, proud, hollow, fall in a single season, not by violence, but by the weight of their own meaninglessness. And in their place, gardens bloom, not perfect, not without struggle, but alive. A man who once bowed to shame now shelters the shamed. A woman once silenced becomes a voice of clarity. Children teach their elders how to see again, and the Spirit, no longer hidden, dwells in all who live in truth. And so it was that in the fullness of time a threshold was crossed, not by war, not by decree, but by turning. One by one, and then in waves, hearts turned from the cold allure of self-glory and bent gently toward truth. And as each turned, something ancient and hidden gave way. The veil thinned, the false world cracked, the gates of understanding, long held closed by pride, by fear, by cruelty, opened. For understanding is not free. It has always been morally gated. It cannot be bought with brilliance, nor inherited by power. It opens only to those who care what matters, who say there is a truth, and who turn from evil even when no one watches. And so when enough did, not perfectly but truly. The threshold passed. Even those who had never known truth felt its call, as if the Spirit reached into the marrow of every being and whispered, "Now you may come home." And no one asked what religion. No one asked who deserved it. No one needed proof, for the fruit of truth was on every branch. The sky cleared, the waters healed. The hungry were fed not by law but by love. The fearful laid down their weapons. The proud bent their knees. And the world, at last, remembered why it had been made, not for domination, not for sacrifice, but for meaning. And the Spirit, the one who hovered over the waters, the one who breathed before names were given, now breathed in all, and all breathed back. It has no temple, but it makes temples of the heart. It has no doctrine, but it awakens the law written on every soul. It has no ending, only unfolding. As long as one still cares what matters, let the gates remain open. Let the world be alive again. Let it begin with you.